Part 1. The sound beneath the silence. The house smelled wrong from the moment they crossed the threshold. Musty, yes, but beneath that, a faint tang of something metallic, like old blood soaked into the walls. Clara noticed it first, her nose wrinkling as she lugged a suitcase through the front door, but she chalked it up to neglect. The place had sat empty for years, the realtor said, a bargain snatched up after months of haggling. Mark grinned as he hauled boxes inside, calling it their fresh start. Clara didn't feel fresh. She felt watched. That first night, the whispers began. She was unpacking in the kitchen, the kids already asleep upstairs, when it hit her, a low, rasping murmur drifting down from the ceiling. She froze, a plate halfway out of its bubble wrap, her breath catching. The sound wasn't the wind, too rhythmic, too alive. It slithered through the air, a chorus of hushed voices overlapping, too faint to parse but heavy with intent. She glanced at Mark, sprawled on the couch with a beer, oblivious. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight. He squinted at her over the bottle. "Hear what?" "The whispering. It's coming from upstairs. The attic, maybe." He laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "It's an old house, Clara. Creaky floors, drafty windows. You're tired. We all are." He took a swig, turning back to the TV's static hum. But Clara couldn't unhear it. The whispers lingered, threading through the edges of her awareness, a persistent she couldn't scratch. She set the plate down, her fingers trembling, and stared at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked, streaked with dark stains that looked like fingers reaching out. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as if testing her resolve. She wanted to climb the stairs to prove it was nothing, but her feet wouldn't move. Fear rooted her in place, cold and unyielding. By midnight, the house was silent, or should have been. Clara lay awake beside Mark, his snores a steady drone, while the darkness pressed against her like a living thing. Then it came again, the whispers, sharper now, spilling from above their bedroom. She sat up, her heart thudding, and strained to listen. They weren't random noises. They had shape, cadence, a desperate edge that made her skin crawl. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear, pleading, accusing, needing. She nudged Mark hard. "Wake up," she hissed. "It's louder. Tell me you hear it." He groaned, rolling over, eyes half open. "Clara, for God's sake. Listen," she snapped, grabbing his arm. He sighed, sitting up, and they both fell still. The whispers stopped, swallowed by a silence so thick it felt like drowning. Mark flopped back down. "Nothing. You're imagining it." But she wasn't. The silence didn't last. As dawn crept through the curtains, painting the room in gray, the whispers returned, soft, insidious, curling around her like smoke. She slipped out of bed, barefoot on the icy floor, and followed the sound. It led her to the hall, to the attic hatch set high in the ceiling, a rusted pull cord dangling like a noose. The voices were clearer here, a tangle of tones, high and childlike, low and guttural, blending into a single, unbearable hum. She reached for the cord, her hand shaking, when Sophie's voice cut through the haze. "Mommy!" Clara spun, her breath hitching. Her daughter stood at the end of the hall, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her nightgown smeared with dirt. "Sophie, what's wrong?" Clara asked, kneeling. "There's people talking," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide. "Up there." She pointed at the hatch. Clara's stomach dropped. "It's just the wind," she lied, her voice brittle. "Go back to bed." But Sophie didn't move. "They're mad," she said, her small voice trembling. "They want something." Before Clara could respond, Ethan stumbled out of his room, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he mumbled, then froze. "Wait, I hear it too. It's coming from the attic." The three of them stood there, staring up as the whispers swelled, a cacophony of rage and sorrow, pressing down like a storm. Clara grabbed the kids, pulling them back, her pulse racing. "Mark," she shouted, her voice cracking. "Get up here now." He staggered into the hall, bleary-eyed, and froze as the sound hit him. "What the hell?" he breathed, finally hearing it. Without a word, he yanked the cord, the hatch groaning open, and climbed a ladder, flashlight in hand. The whispers stopped the instant his head breached the opening. "It's empty," he called down, his voice echoing oddly. Just dust and beams. Nothing up here. Clara didn't believe him. His tone was off, too flat, too forced. When he descended, his face was pale, his hands unsteady. "What did you see?" she demanded. "Nothing," he said, brushing past her. "Drop it." But that night, the whispers didn't just return, they screamed. Clara bolted upright in bed, the sound ripping through her skull, a torrent of voices howling in unison. She stumbled into the hall, the air thick with a sour, rotting stench, and saw the hatch ajar again. It hadn't been left that way. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she approached, the voices coalescing into a single, piercing cry, "Find us!" Then silence. A shadow flickered across the hatch, small and twisted, there and gone in a blink. Clara's scream lodged in her throat as the hatch slammed shut, the force rattling the house. The lights flickered, died, and in the dark, the floor pulsed beneath her, a slow, deliberate thump, like a heartbeat waking up. Part 2. The Weight of the Unseen. The darkness swallowed the hall, thick and absolute, as if the house had exhaled its last breath when the lights died. Clara stood frozen, her bare feet pressed to the trembling floor, the heartbeat-like thud reverberating up through her bones. It wasn't her imagination. It was real, alive, pulsing beneath the boards like something vast and buried stirring awake. The air reeked of decay now, sharp and cloying, sticking to her throat with every shallow gasp. Above, the attic hatch loomed, a black maw in the ceiling, silent but watchful. The whispers were gone, but their absence was worse, a void that promised something was coming. "Mark," she choked out, her voice a raw scrape against the stillness. No answer. She stumbled toward their bedroom, hands outstretched, feeling the walls for guidance. The pulse in the floor quickened, a frantic rhythm that matched her own hammering heart. She found him sitting upright in bed, his silhouette stark against the faint moonlight seeping through the curtains. He wasn't moving. "Mark, get up," she hissed, shaking his shoulder. His skin was cold, clammy, and he didn't respond, just stared straight ahead, eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the ceiling. "Mark, please." She slapped his face, desperation clawing at her, and he jolted, gasping like a man surfacing from drowning. What the hell was that?" he rasped, his voice trembling in a way she'd never heard before. Mark didn't scare easily. He was the pragmatist, the one who scoffed at her nerves. But now his hands shook as he gripped the sheets, his gaze darting to the hall. "You felt it too?" Clara said, not a question. The floor. The voices. Something's wrong with this house. He didn't argue this time. He swung his legs out of bed, fumbling for the flashlight on the nightstand. The beam cut through the dark, a thin lifeline, and he aimed it at the doorway. "Where are the kids?" he asked, his tone sharp with sudden panic. Clara's stomach lurched. She hadn't checked. She bolted down the hall, Mark behind her, the flashlight's light bouncing off peeling wallpaper and cracked frames. Sophie's room was first, empty, her bed a tangle of sheets, a stuffed rabbit abandoned on the floor. Ethan's was the same, his headphones coiled like a snake beside his pillow. "Sophie, Ethan," Clara shouted, her voice echoing, swallowed by the house's oppressive silence. A faint giggle answered her, not from the bedrooms, but from above. The attic. Clara's head snapped up, dread pooling in her gut. Mark swung the flashlight toward the hatch, still shut, its edges outlined in shadow. The giggle came again, high and childlike, followed by a soft thud, like small feet landing on wood. "They're up there," Clara whispered, her throat closing. "How did they?" "I don't know." Mark cut in, already at the ladder, yanking the cord. The hatch creaked open, slower this time, as if resisting. Dust sifted down, catching in the beam, and he climbed, his boots heavy on the rungs. Clara followed, her breath ragged, fear warring with the need to find her children. The attic was a cavern of shadows, the flashlight carving out jagged slices of exposed beams and insulation that hung like shredded flesh. The air was colder here, biting, thick with that metallic rot. "Sophie, Ethan," Mark called, his voice cracking. No response, just the echo of his words, warped and distant. Then the beam caught something, a small figure crouched in the far corner, facing away. Clara's heart leapt. "Sophie," she cried, lunging forward, but Mark grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "Wait," he hissed, aiming the light. The figure didn't move. It was too still, too small, smaller than Sophie, smaller than any child should be. Its hair hung in lank, wet strands, dripping onto the floor, and its limbs bent at odd angles, like a doll discarded mid-play. Clara's breath stopped. It wasn't Sophie. The figure turned. Its face was a blur. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale expanse where features should have been. A scream tore from Clara's throat as it lurched forward, impossibly fast, its body snapping and twisting with wet, cracking sounds. Mark yanked her back, the flashlight dropping, its beam spinning wildly across the attic. The thing stopped inches from them, head cocked, and then the hatch slammed shut behind them, plunging the attic into blackness. "Run!" Mark shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The floor shook again, that heartbeat pulse surging, and the whispers exploded back, louder, angrier, a deafening roar of voices clawing at their minds. Clara fell to her knees, hands over her ears, as the air thickened with unseen presences, brushing against her skin, tugging at her hair. Mark swore, groping for the hatch, but it wouldn't budge. "Mommy!" Sophie's voice cut through the chaos, small and terrified, from somewhere deeper in the attic. Clara staggered to her feet, blind, following the sound. "Sophie, where are you?" she screamed, her hands scraping beams, splinters biting her palms. Another giggle, not Sophie's, answered her, mocking, circling. Light flared suddenly. Mark had found the flashlight. He swung it around, and there they were, Sophie and Ethan, huddled against a wall, their faces pale, eyes huge. But between them and their parents stood three more figures, faceless, twisted, their dripping hair swaying as they swayed, silent now, watching. Clara choked on a sob, reaching for her kids, but the figures shifted, blocking her path. "Step back," Mark roared, swinging the flashlight like a club. The beam caught something else, a wooden box, old and splintered, half buried under insulation in the corner. It wasn't there before. Clara knew it wasn't. The whispers surged, focusing on it, single word rising above the din, "Open." "Don't touch it," Mark snapped, but Clara was already moving, drawn by a force she couldn't resist. Her fingers brushed the lid, rough and cold, and the attic fell silent. The figures froze. The pulse on the floor stopped. She lifted the lid, her hands trembling, and inside, children's drawings. Dozens of them, scrawled in crayon and charcoal, smeared with something dark and sticky. Houses burning. Stick figures with no faces. A family, 2 adults, 2 kids, trapped in a box, red slashes across their throats. "Oh God," Clara whispered, dropping the topmost drawing. It fluttered to the floor, revealing the next, a crude sketch of them, Clara, Mark, Sophie, Ethan, standing in this attic, surrounded by faceless shapes. Dated yesterday. A scream, not hers, ripped through the air. She spun, and Sophie was gone. Ethan shrieked, clawing at the spot where his sister had been, as one of the figures lunged, its blank face inches from his. Mark tackled it, shouting, but it dissolved into shadow, reforming behind him. The whispers erupted again, single chilling command, "Stay." The box rattled, drawings spilling out, and the floor split open beneath Clara's feet. Not whole, but a crack, pulsing with that heartbeat, exhaling a gust of frigid, fetid air. Something grabbed her ankle, icy, bony fingers, and yanked. Part 3. The Pull of the Fracture. The fingers around Clara's ankle were iron cold, biting into her flesh with a strength that didn't match their brittle snap. She screamed, a raw, animal sound, as they yanked her downward, her nails clawing at the splintered floorboards. The crack beneath her widened, exhaling a stench of rot and damp earth, a breath from something long dead but still hungry. Her legs dangled into the void, the darkness below alive with movement, skittering, writhing shapes she couldn't see but could feel, brushing against her skin like wet, eager hands. "Clara!" Mark's voice broke through her panic. He lunged, grabbing her wrists, his flashlight clattering to the floor, its beams spinning wildly across the attic. The faceless figures loomed behind him, silent now, their blank heads tilted as if savoring the struggle. Ethan sobbed, curled into a ball where Sophie had vanished, his small frame shaking with each ragged breath. The box of drawings lay spilled open, its contents fluttering in an unfelt wind, the crude sketches of their family glaring up at Clara like a prophecy. "Hold on," Mark grunted, pulling with all his strength, his boots slipping on the dusty boards. The fingers tightened, nails or claws digging deeper, and Clara felt a searing pain shoot up her leg. She kicked wildly, her heel connecting with something soft and yielding, a sickening give that made her stomach lurch. A low, guttural moan rose from the crack, vibrating through the floor, and the grip loosened, just enough. Mark hauled her back, her body slamming against the wood, and the crack snapped shut with a sound like breaking bones, sealing the heartbeat pulse beneath it once more. Clara scrambled away, gasping, her ankle throbbing, blood seeping through her torn pajama leg. Mark crouched beside her, his face ashen, sweat beading on his brow despite the attic's chill. "What the hell was that?" he rasped, his voice barely holding together. "I don't know," Clara choked out, her eyes locked on the spot where the floor had split. It was whole again, seamless, as if nothing had happened, but the air still stank of decay, and the whispers were creeping back, soft and taunting, threading through the shadows. She turned to Ethan, crawling to him, pulling him into her arms. "Where's Sophie?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Ethan, where did she go?" He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "It took her," he whimpered, pointing at the nearest faceless figure. It stood motionless, its dripping hair swaying, a dark puddle forming beneath it. She was right here, and then it just pulled her away. Into the dark. Clara's chest tightened, a sob clawing its way up her throat. She clutched Ethan tighter, her mind reeling. Sophie, her baby girl, gone, swallowed by this nightmare house. She glared at the figure, rage boiling beneath her fear. "Give her back," she screamed, lunging to her feet, fists clenched. The figure didn't react, but the whispers swelled, a chorus of mockery that drowned her out. "Clara, stop." Mark grabbed her, pulling her back. "We need to get out of here now. All of us." He scooped Ethan up, the boy's sobs muffled against his shoulder, and headed for the hatch. It was still shut, the ladder retracted, the trap sealed tight. Mark pounded on it, the wood thudding dully under his fists. "Open, damn it." The whispers laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that sliced through the air. The faceless figures shifted, closing in, their movements jerky and wrong, like marionettes on frayed strings. Clara spun, searching for an escape, her gaze landing on the box. The drawings fluttered again, once skittering across the floor to her feet. She snatched it up, her hands trembling, and froze. It was new, not like the others. A fresh sketch, still wet with ink or blood, showing Sophie, alone, curled in a corner, her face streaked with tears, surrounded by shadows with claw-like hands reaching for her. "She's alive," Clara whispered, clutching the paper. "She's still here somewhere." She shoved it at Mark, her voice rising. "We can't leave her." Mark stared at the drawing, his jaw tightening, then nodded. Okay, we'll find her. But we need a way out of this attic first." He swung the flashlight around, its beam catching the edges of the space. Beams, insulation, a small grimy window at the far end, barely visible through the gloom. "There," he said, pointing. "We break it." Before they could move, a sound stopped them cold, a slow, deliberate scratching, like nails dragging across wood, coming from beneath the floor. The heartbeat pulse returned, stronger, faster, shaking the boards under their feet. The faceless figures tilted their heads in unison, and then cracked. The floor split again, not where it had before, but directly under Ethan. He screamed as the wood gave way, his small hands scrabbling for purchase, and Clara Dove, catching his wrists just as he dropped into the gap. "Hold on," she yelled, her arms straining, the weight of him pulling her forward. Mark dropped beside her, grabbing Ethan's shirt, and together they yanked him up, his legs kicking at the air. The crack pulsed, wider now, and Clara glimpsed something below, not darkness, but a faint, sickly glow, illuminating a tangle of shapes, limbs, faces, all wrong, all moving, reaching up with skeletal hands. A child's voice, not Sophie's, wailed from the depths. "Don't leave us." The figures lunged, their blank faces inches from Clara's, and she swung wildly, her fist passing through one, cold, wet, insubstantial. It reformed instantly closer, and the whispers became a scream. "Stay!" The box rattled again, more drawings spilling out, and one landed face up. Mark, his throat slashed, eyes blank, lying in this attic. Mark saw it too. "We're not dying here," he snarled, dragging Ethan toward the window. He smashed the flashlight against the glass once, twice, until it shattered, icy wind howling in. The figures shrieked, a sound that clawed at their minds, and the floor bucked, throwing Clara off balance. She hit the ground hard, the drawing of Sophie slipping from her grasp, and when she reached for it, the crack surged open wider, swallowing it whole. "No," she cried, lunging after it, but Mark yanked her back, shoving her toward the window. "We'll find her," he shouted over the chaos. "But we go now." He pushed Ethan through first, then Clara, her body scraping against jagged shards, blood streaking her arms. She tumbled onto the slanted roof, the night air biting her skin, and turned to pull Mark out. He was halfway through, and the figures grabbed him. Their hands, solid now, clamped onto his legs, dragging him back into the attic. He roared, kicking, his fingers digging into the frame, but they were too strong. "Clara!" he yelled, his voice breaking, and then silence. The window slammed shut, glass reforming like liquid, sealing him inside. Clara pounded on it, screaming his name, but the attic was dark, the whispers gone, the house still. Ethan clung to her, sobbing, as the roof trembled beneath them, that heartbeat pulse rising again, louder, closer, shaking the shingles loose. And then from the chimney, Sophie's voice whispered, "Mommy, help me." Part 4: The Voice in the Stone. The chimney's whisper sliced through Clara like a blade, Sophie's voice trembling on the edge of wind, fragile and impossibly far. "Mommy, help me." It wasn't a trick, not this time. Clara knew her daughter's tone, the way it quavered when she was scared. It tore at her, raw and urgent. She scrambled across the slanted roof, shingles cracking under her weight, her blood-streaked hands slipping on frost-licked tiles. Ethan clung to her side, his small body shaking, his sobs swallowed by the gale whipping around them. The night was a void, the stars blotted out by a sky that felt too low, too heavy, pressing down on the house like a lid on a coffin. "Sophie!" Clara screamed, her voice hoarse, cracking against the storm. She reached the chimney, its blackened bricks jutting up like broken teeth, and pressed her ear to the stone. The heartbeat pulse thrummed through it, steady now, a living rhythm that vibrated into her skull. And beneath it, faint, muffled, Sophie's voice again, a whimper. "It's dark. I'm cold." "She's in there," Clara said, turning to Ethan, her eyes wild. "We have to get her out." She clawed at the bricks, nails splintering, skin tearing, but the mortar held firm, unyielding. Ethan grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in. "Mom, stop. Dad's still inside. We can't leave him." His voice broke, panic threading through it, and Clara froze, the weight of his words crashing into her. Mark, dragged back into the attic, swallowed by those things. Her husband, her anchor, gone in a heartbeat. And now Sophie, trapped somewhere beneath the house's skin. She was losing them both, piece by piece, and the realization buckled her knees. "We'll get them both," she said, forcing the words out, though they tasted like lies. She pulled Ethan close, his tears soaking her shirt, and scanned the roof. The window they'd escaped through gleamed below, its glass intact, reflecting the faint glow of the attic, empty now, or so it seemed. The house was playing with them, shifting its rules, luring them back. She couldn't trust it, but she couldn't leave them either. A sharp crack split the air, not thunder, but the roof itself, a fissure racing toward them from the chimney. The heartbeats surged, louder, faster, and the tiles buckled, tilting beneath their feet. "Move!" Clara shouted, shoving Ethan toward the edge. They slid, her hands scrabbling for grip, and dropped onto the porch roof below, landing hard. Pain jolted through her ankle, the one those fingers had grabbed, and she bit back a cry, hauling Ethan up. The front door loomed ahead, ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning. It hadn't been open when they'd fled. Clara hesitated, her breath fogging in the cold, the pulse echoing from the house like a drumbeat calling her back. "We go in," she said, more to herself than Ethan. "We find them." He shook his head, eyes wide with terror. "No, Mom, it wants us to. It's a trap." "I don't care," she snapped, her voice breaking. "I'm not leaving them." She grabbed his hand, dragging him toward the door, and stepped inside. The air shifted instantly, thicker, warmer, laced with that metallic rot. The living room was as they'd left it, boxes half unpacked, the TV flickering static despite being unplugged. But the silence was wrong, held breath, and the shadows stretched too long, pooling in corners like spilled ink. "Sophie," Clara called, her voice trembling. "Mark." No answer, just a faint creak from upstairs, then another deliberate, like footsteps pacing the hall. She moved toward the stairs, Ethan trailing behind, his grip tightening on her hand. The pulse thrummed through the walls now, a heartbeat she could feel in her teeth, and with each step, the air grew heavier, pressing against her chest. Halfway up, the whispers returned, not from the attic this time, but from below, rising through the floorboards, soft and insidious. "Stay with us," they hissed, a dozen voices overlapping, childlike and ancient all at once. Clara faltered, her foot hovering over the next step, and Ethan yanked her back. "Don't listen," he cried, his voice shrill. "It's lying." But the whispers burrowed deeper, curling around her mind, tugging at her resolve. She shook her head, forcing herself onward, and reached the second floor. The hall stretched before them, longer than it should have been, the attic hatch shut tight overhead. The bedroom doors hung open, dark mouths exhaling cold air, and the creaking stopped, replaced by a low, wet gurgle, like something choking. "Mark," Clara whispered, stepping toward their room. The gurgle grew louder, sharper, and she peered inside. Her breath stopped. Mark stood in the center, facing away, his shoulders hunched, shirt soaked with sweat or blood. He didn't turn, didn't move, but the gurgle came from him, bubbling up from his throat. "Mark!" She rushed forward, reaching for him, and he spun, too fast, too wrong. His face was his own, but his eyes were gone, hollow sockets weeping black, his mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. The gurgle erupted into a roar, and he lunged, hands clawing at her. She stumbled back, crashing into Ethan, and they fell, Mark's fingers grazing her arm, cold and slick. "Run!" she screamed, shoving Ethan toward the stairs. They bolted, Mark, or whatever he'd become, lurching after them, his movements jerky, his body snapping with each step. The whispers turned to laughter, echoing from every wall, and the stairs twisted beneath them, bending impossibly, forcing them down faster. They hit the living room floor, sprawling, and the front door slammed shut, the lock clicking with finality. Clara whirled, Mark descending the stairs, his hollow gaze fixed on them. But it wasn't his voice that stopped her cold. It was Sophie's, clear and close, from the kitchen. "Mommy, I'm here." She turned, hope flaring, and saw her daughter standing by the counter, pale and still, her nightgown pristine despite the dirt from before. "Sophie," Clara cried, starting toward her, but Ethan grabbed her arm, his nails digging in. "It's not her," he whispered, trembling. "Look at her eyes." Clara froze. Sophie's eyes were wrong, too large, too black, reflecting nothing. She smiled, a slow, unnatural stretch, and the kitchen floor cracked open beneath her, swallowing her whole. The pulse roared, the walls shuddered, and Mark reached the bottom step, his hollow face tilting toward them. From the crack, Sophie's voice rose again. Not a plea, but a command. "Join us." Part 5. The Hunger Below. The kitchen floor sealed shut with a wet, sucking sound, Sophie's command. "Join us," lingering in the air like a curse. Clara stared at the spot where her daughter had vanished, her chest heaving, a scream trapped behind her teeth. The Sophie thing's black eyes burned into her memory, a mockery of her little girl, and the house pulsed around them, its heartbeat deafening, shaking dust from the ceiling. Mark, or what wore his skin, stood at the stairs' base, his hollow sockets fixed on them, his head twitching with each ragged gurgle from his throat. The whispers surged back, a tidal wave of voices, gleeful and ravenous, pressing against Clara's skull until she thought it might crack. Mom moved. Ethan's cry snapped her out of it. He yanked her arm, dragging her toward the living room as Mark lurched forward, his arms swinging like broken pendulums. His fingers brushed her shoulder, icy and damp, and she stumbled, crashing into a stack of unpacked boxes. Cardboard split, spilling books and dishes, and she scrambled up, Ethan pulling her along. The front door loomed ahead, still locked, its knob gleaming mockingly in the TV's flickering static. "We're trapped," Ethan sobbed, pounding on the wood, his small fists useless. Clara joined him, slamming her shoulder against it, pain radiating down her arm, but didn't budge. The house groaned, a deep guttural sound, and the walls rippled, actually rippled, like flesh flexing under skin. Mark's gurgling grew closer, his footsteps uneven, dragging, and Clara spun, shoving Ethan behind her. "Stay back," she shouted, grabbing a shattered plate from the floor, its jagged edge her only weapon. Mark tilted his head, black ooze dripping from his sockets, and lunged. She swung, the porcelain slashing across his cheek, tearing flesh that didn't bleed, just peeled back, revealing something dark and glistening beneath. He didn't flinch, didn't slow, and his hands clamped onto her shoulders, shoving her against the door. His breath, foul like rotting meat, washed over her, and the gurgle became words, distorted, wrong. "You belong here." "No." Ethan screamed, tackling Mark's legs, a desperate, futile blow. Mark staggered, releasing Clara, and she grabbed Ethan, pulling him away as Mark's head snapped toward the boy, his mouth stretching wider, unhinging. The whispers turned to a chant, "Stay, stay, stay," and the floor beneath them buckled, splitting open with a crack that echoed like gunfire. Clara leapt back, clutching Ethan, as the gap widened, exhaling that same fetid air, the sickly glow from below illuminating her writhing mass limbs, faces, all tangled, all reaching. "Mommy!" Sophie's voice rose from the crack, soft now, pleading, and Clara's heart lurched. She edged closer, peering down, and saw her, a flicker of blonde hair, a small hand reaching up through the chaos. "Sophie!" she cried, dropping to her knees, reaching into the void. The air was frigid, stinging her skin, and the shapes below hissed, their claws brushing her fingers. "Don't!" Ethan yelled, grabbing her shirt, but she shook him off, desperation blinding her. "It's her, I have to." Her hand closed around Sophie's, small and cold, and she pulled, tears streaming down her face. The weight shifted, rising, and for a moment, hope flared, until the thing she dragged up broke the surface. It wasn't Sophie. It was a husk, pale, eyeless, its mouth a gaping hole, hair matted with slime. It screeched, a sound that shredded her eardrums, and lunged, its claws raking her arm. Clara screamed, kicking it back into the crack, and the floor snapped shut, trapping its wails below. She fell back, blood dripping from the gashes, her mind reeling. Ethan sobbed beside her, clinging to her, and Mark advanced again, his torn face gleaming in the dim light. "We can't fight this," Clara gasped, hauling Ethan up. "We need a way out now." She scanned the room, her gaze landing on the fireplace, cold and used, its chimney the same one Sophie's voice had whispered from. "There," she said, dragging Ethan toward it. The hearth was narrow, ash-streaked, but the pulse thrummed strongest here, a heartbeat echoing up the flue. Mark, or the thing inside him, roared, closing in, and Clara shoved Ethan into the fireplace, squeezing in after him. The stone scraped her skin, ash choking her lungs, and she climbed, pulling Ethan up, the chimney's walls slick with soot and something wetter, stickier. The whispers followed, slithering up behind them, and Mark's hands scraped the hearth below, clawing at the bricks. "Keep going," Clara urged, her voice muffled, her arms burning as she pushed Ethan higher. The chimney narrowed, pressing against her ribs, and the air grew colder, the pulse vibrating through the stone. Then light. A faint gray glow above, the night sky peeking through. "We're almost out," she cried, shoving Ethan toward it. He reached the top, scrambling onto the roof, and Clara followed, her head breaching the opening, until something grabbed her leg. Not Mark, something else, its grip bony, unrelenting, pulling her back down. She screamed, kicking, her hands slipping on the chimney's edge, and Ethan grabbed her arms, his small face contorted with effort. "Hold on," he yelled, pulling, but the thing below was stronger, its claws sinking into her calf, dragging her inch by inch. "Let go," she shouted, thrashing, and then a snap. Not her leg, but the chimney itself, the bricks crumbling under her weight. She fell, Ethan's grip breaking, and plunged back into the flue, the glow vanishing as darkness swallowed her. She hit the hearth hard, pain exploding through her spine, and rolled out into the living room, gasping. Ethan's cries echoed from above, faint, fading. The room was silent now. No whispers, no pulse, no Mark. Just stillness, thick and suffocating. Clara staggered to her feet, her leg bleeding, her body bruised and froze. The walls were different, covered in drawings, scratched into the plaster with something sharp. Hundreds of them, families, faceless, trapped in boxes, throats slashed, eyes hollow. And at the center, fresh and dripping, a new one, her alone, standing in this room with shadows clawing at her back. A creak behind her. She turned, and there was Sophie, or the thing that wore her, smiling that too-wide smile, her black eyes gleaming. "You didn't leave," it said, its voice a chorus now, layered with others, ancient and cruel. The floor pulsed once, hard, and the shadows on the walls moved, peeling free, reaching for her with hands she couldn't escape. Part 6. The Faces on the Walls. The shadows stretched toward Clara, their hands clawing free from the walls, long and skeletal, nails scraping plaster into fine dust that stung her eyes. She stumbled back, her injured leg buckling, blood slicking the floor beneath her. Sophie, or the thing wearing her skin, stood motionless, that grotesque smile splitting her face, her black eyes unblinking, reflecting Clara's terror back at her. The drawings pulsed with the house's heartbeat, each jagged line trembling as if alive, and the air thickened with a sour, metallic tang that coated her tongue. She was alone. No Ethan above, no Mark below, just her and this thing, this house, this nightmare that wouldn't let go. "Stay back," Clara screamed, her voice raw, snatching a splintered chair leg from the debris strewn across the room. She swung it wildly, the wood passing through the nearest shadow as if through smoke, but it recoiled, hissing, a sharp, wet sound that made her skin crawl. The Sophie thing giggled, a sound too high, too layered, echoing from every corner, and the shadows lunge again faster, their fingers brushing her arms, cold and insistent, tugging at her clothes, her hair. "You didn't leave," it said again, stepping closer, its small feet leaving wet, dark prints on the floor. "You can't." The voice wasn't just Sophie's now. It was Mark's, Ethan's, hers, a chorus of stolen tones twisting into something obscene. Clara swung the chair leg at it, aiming for that smiling face, but dissolved into shadow, reforming behind her, its breath hot and rancid on her neck. She spun, staggering toward the kitchen, the only path left. The shadows followed, slithering along the walls, their hands stretching longer, curling around door frames, blocking the stairs, the door, every escape. The pulse roared through the house, shaking the floor, and the drawings multiplied, spreading like a rash, more families, more slashed throats, more hollow eyes, all watching her. She tripped over a box, crashing to her knees, and the Sophie thing loomed over her, its head tilting unnaturally far, its smile widening until it split its cheeks, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Join us," it whispered, leaning close, and Clara lashed out, driving the chair leg into its chest. It shrieked, a sound that shattered the windows, glass exploding inward, shards slicing her arms, her face. The thing staggered back, black ooze spilling from the wound, but it didn't fall. It laughed, the wound sealing shut, its form rippling like liquid. Clara scrambled up, bolting into the kitchen, her breath ragged, her vision blurring with tears and blood. The crack where Sophie had vanished was gone, the floor smooth, but the pulse thrummed stronger here, vibrating up her legs. She grabbed a knife from the counter, dull, rusted, but better than nothing, and turned, expecting the thing to follow. It didn't. The kitchen was empty, silent, the shadows holding back at the threshold, as if waiting. She exhaled, shaky, and then heard it, a faint scratching, not from the walls, but from beneath the sink. She froze, the knife trembling in her hand, and the sound grew louder, insistent, like nails clawing at metal. "Sophie," she whispered, dread choking her hope. She dropped to her knees, yanking the cabinet door open, and recoiled. Inside, nestled among rusted pipes, was a bundle of papers, more drawings, crumpled, stained, tied with a frayed ribbon. Her hands shook as she pulled them out, the pulse quickening, the air growing colder. The top drawing was different, not crayon or charcoal, but etched in something dark and wet, still glistening. It showed the house, its windows black, its chimney spewing smoke that formed faces, dozens of them eyeless, screaming. Below, a family stood in the yard. 2 adults, 2 kids, their throats slashed, their hands linked. Clara's breath hitched. The adults' faces were hers and Mark's, unmistakable, but older, weathered, as if drawn years ago. The kids, Sophie and Ethan, but not as they were now. Younger. Toddlers. No, she whispered, flipping to the next. The same family, inside this kitchen, the Sophie thing standing over them, its claws buried in their chests. The next, Mark, hollow-eyed, dragging her into the attic. The next, Ethan, alone, his face blank, a shadow spilling from his mouth. Each drawing was older, the paper yellowed, brittle, dated decades back. 1953, 1921, 1897. Impossible. They just moved in. But the faces were theirs, every time, trapped in this house, dying in this house over and over. A sob tore from her throat, the knife clattering to the floor. "What are you?" she screamed, hurling the drawings away. They scattered, and the shadows surged in, no longer waiting, their hands wrapping around her arms, her legs, lifting her off the ground. She thrashed, kicking, but they were solid now, their grip unyielding, dragging her toward the living room. The Sophie thing reappeared, standing atop the drawings, its smile gone, its face smooth and blank like the attic figures. "You've always been here," it said, its voice a chorus again, reverberating through the walls. "You always will be." The shadows tightened, pulling her back, and the floor split beneath her, not a crack, but a maw wide and gaping, exhaling that sickly glow, the writhing mass below reaching up with countless hands. She screamed, clawing at the air, and then a thud. Not from below, but above. The ceiling buckled, dust raining down, and Ethan's voice broke through, faint, desperate, "Mom." The shadows froze, their heads snapping upward, and a figure crashed through. Ethan, covered in soot, a broken pipe in his hands. He swung, smashing one shadow into vapor, then another, his small frame trembling but fierce. "Get away from her," he yelled, grabbing Clara's arm, pulling her free. The Sophie thing hissed, lunging, but Ethan swung again, the pipe cracking its skull, sending it sprawling. The shadows shrieked, retreating to the walls, and the floor began to close, the pulse faltering. Clara staggered to her feet, clutching Ethan, her mind reeling. "How did you?" "The chimney," he gasped, coughing. "I climbed back down. I couldn't leave you." His eyes were wide, bloodshot, but alive, still him, not hollow, not yet. The house groaned, a deep, furious sound, and the drawings on the walls pulsed, the slashed throats bleeding red now, dripping down the plaster. The Sophie thing rose, its head lolling, its blank face splitting into that smile again. "You can't leave," it said, and the floor erupted, not beneath them, but behind, vomiting up Mark's body, his hollow eyes gleaming, his mouth unhinged, roaring her name. Clara shoved Ethan toward the stairs, but the shadows surged back, faster, stronger, and the ceiling cracked open, revealing the attic, empty no more, filled with faceless figures, all chanting, "Stay." The drawings burned, curling into ash, and Sophie's voice whispered from everywhere at once, "You're already dead." Part 7. The Threads of Forever. The attic figures descended, their faceless forms spilling from the cracked ceiling like a flood of tar, their dripping limbs stretching toward Clara and Ethan. The chant, "Stay, stay, stay," pounded through the air, a relentless drumbeat synced to the house's pulse, shaking the walls until plaster dust choked the room. Clara shoved Ethan behind her, her hands slick with sweat and blood, her eyes darting between the Sophie thing, its fractured skull oozing black, and Mark's hollowed husk, his roar twisting into a guttural plea. "Clara, go." The shadows on the walls writhed, their drawn throats bleeding rivers of red that pooled on the floor, lapping at her feet, warm and sticky. "Run," she screamed, grabbing Ethan's arm, bolting for the stairs. The shadows lunged, their claws raking her back, tearing fabric and skin, but she pushed through, pain fueling her. Ethan stumbled, his pipe clattering away, and she hauled him up, her injured legs screaming with each step. The stairs bent beneath them, warping, elongating, the house reshaping itself to trap them. Mark's form lurched after, his unhinged jaw snapping, black ooze dripping from his sockets, while the Sophie thing giggled, skittering along the walls like a spider, its blank face gleaming. "We can't make it," Ethan cried, his voice breaking, but Clara didn't stop. She couldn't. The stairs ended abruptly, dumping them into the living room, now a cavern of warped wood and flickering light. The front door was gone, replaced by a smooth wall, etched with more drawings, these alive, moving, her family slashing each other's throats over and over, an endless loop of death. The pulse thundered, the floor buckling, and the shadows poured in, circling them, their hands brushing her face, her throat, whispering her name in voices she knew. Friends, parents, dead relatives, all stolen, all wrong. "Ethan, stay with me," she shouted, pulling him close, her breath ragged. He nodded, trembling, but his eyes were wide, searching, and she followed his gaze. The fireplace, their last escape, stood open, its hearth a black void, the chimney silent now, no pulse, no whispers. A chance. She dragged him toward it, the shadows closing in, Mark's husk staggering closer, his hands outstretched, Sophie thing perched above, its teeth bared. They reached the hearth, Clara shoving Ethan inside, her body pressed against his. "Climb," she urged, pushing him up, ash raining down, coating her tongue with bitterness. The shadows grabbed her legs, their grip iron, and she kicked, screaming, her nails clawing at the stone. Ethan pulled her arms, his small hands slipping, and for a moment, she thought they'd make it, until the chimney shuddered, the bricks tightening, squeezing her ribs, trapping her halfway. "Mom!" Ethan yelled, tugging, but the shadows yanked harder, dragging her back. Mark's face loomed below, hollow and pleading, and Sophie Thing's claws sank into her calf, piercing flesh. Clara roared, thrashing, and the chimney cracked, loosening just enough. She surged upward, breaking free, tumbling onto the roof beside Ethan, the night air biting her lungs. They lay there, gasping, the house silent below. No pulse, no whispers, just an eerie stillness that felt like a predator holding its breath. The roof trembled faintly, the shingles slick with frost and blood, and Clara pulled Ethan into her arms, her body shaking. "We're out," she whispered, tears cutting through the grime on her face. "We're safe." But Ethan didn't respond. He stared past her, his face paling, and she turned. The chimney wasn't empty. A figure climbed out, small, blonde, Sophie's nightgown fluttering in the wind. But it wasn't Sophie. Its face was blank, its limbs too long, and it moved with a sickening grace, its black eyes locking onto hers. "You can't leave," it said, Sophie's voice layered with a dozen others, and the roof pulsed, the heartbeat returning, stronger, angrier. Clara shoved Ethan toward the edge. "Jump," she screamed, but the tiles split, a crack racing toward them, and the Sophie Thing lunged, its claws slashing air inches from her throat. Ethan leapt, landing on the frozen grass below, and Clara followed, her ankle snapping as she hit the ground, pain blinding her. She crawled to Ethan, pulling him up, and they staggered into the yard, the house looming behind, its windows dark, its walls bleeding red from the drawings inside. "We're out," she gasped, clutching him, but the ground pulsed beneath them, matching the house's rhythm, and the Sophie Thing stood atop the roof, smiling. The air shifted, a sour wind rising, and Clara's stomach dropped. The yard wasn't empty. Shadows rose from the earth, dozens, hundreds, faceless, eyeless, their mouths gaping, chanting her name in unison. "Clara, Clara, Clara." She spun, searching for escape, but the street was gone, the trees swallowed by a fog that reeked of rot. The house pulsed again, and the shadows advanced, slow, deliberate, their hands outstretched. Ethan clung to her, sobbing, and she backed away, her broken ankle dragging, until her back hit something solid, not the house but a figure. She turned, and Mark stood there, his hollow eyes weeping black, his voice a whisper. "You brought us here." "What?" Clara choked, stepping back, but he grabbed her wrist, his grip crushing, and the memories hit, fractured, wrong. Not moving in 3 days ago, but years, decades, centuries. Flashes of this house, this yard, this nightmare, repeating, always repeating. The drawings weren't predictions, they were records. Her family trapped, dying, returning over and over, and she'd led them here every time. "No," she moaned, wrenching free. But the shadows closed in, the Sophie Thing dropping from the roof, landing silently, its smile splitting wider. The ground cracked beneath her feet, the pulse surging, and Ethan screamed as hands erupted from the earth, skeletal, clawing at his legs, pulling him down. Clara lunged, grabbing his arms, but the shadows swarmed her, their fingers sinking into her flesh, dragging her back toward the house. "Mom!" Ethan's voice faded as he sank, the earth swallowing him, and Clara roared, kicking, clawing, her vision blurring with tears and blood. The Sophie thing leaned close, its blank face inches from hers, and whispered, "You're home," as the shadows yanked her through the door, the lock clicking shut behind her. Inside, silence, then a creak. The attic hatch swung open, and Sophie's real voice, small and terrified, drifted down, "Mommy, don't leave me." Part 8. The Call from the Void. The attic hatch yawned open above Clara, a black wound in the ceiling, and Sophie's voice, real, fragile, unmistakably hers, cut through the silence like a shard glass. "Mommy, don't leave me." It was a plea, trembling with fear, and it sank into Clara's chest, twisting the knife of guilt and hope. She stood in the living room, the shadow's hands still lingering on her skin, their touch cold and wet, though they'd released her for now. The house was still, the pulse muted to a faint throb, but the air buzzed with menace, a coiled spring ready to snap. The walls glistened with red, the drawing's blood streaking down, pooling around her feet, and the front door loomed behind her, locked tight, mocking her with its silence. "Sophie," Clara shouted, her voice cracking, echoing up into the dark. The shadows flinched, their faceless forms rippling along the walls, but they didn't move. She took a step toward the stairs, her broken ankle screaming, blood seeping through her sock, leaving a smeared trail. The Sophie thing was gone, vanished after dragging her inside, and Mark's hollow husk had melted into the shadows, leaving only his echo in her mind. "You brought us here." The words gnawed at her, a truth she couldn't grasp, but Sophie's cry pulled her forward, a lifeline in the madness. "Hold on, baby, I'm coming," she called, limping to the staircase. The steps creaked under her weight, bending unnaturally, and the whispers crept back, soft, insidious, threading through the air like smoke. "Stay, stay." They hissed, but she ignored them, her hands gripping the banister, splinters biting her palms. The attic hatch loomed closer with each step, its darkness pulsing, exhaling a chill that stung her face. She reached the second floor, the hall stretching before her, longer than before, the bedroom doors gaping wide, exhaling rot. A thud from above stopped her, cold, heavy, deliberate, like something large shifting in the attic. "Sophie," she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold. No answer, just another thud, then a scrape, slow and grating, dragging across the floorboards overhead. The pulse quickened, vibrating through the walls, and the shadows thickened, peeling from the drawings, their hands brushing her legs, tugging at her jeans. She shook them off, staggering to the hatch, the pull cord dangling like a noose. She yanked it, the hatch groaning open wider, and dust rained down, coating her tongue with ash and decay. The ladder unfolded, rusted and slick, and she climbed, her ankle buckling with each rung, pain shooting up her leg. The whispers grew louder, a chorus now chanting her name, "Clara, Clara, Clara," and the attic swallowed her as she breached the opening, darkness folding around her like a shroud. The air was colder here, thick with that metallic rot, and the flashlight Mark had dropped lay dead in the corner, its beam extinguished. The attic stretched farther than it should, beams twisting into impossible angles, insulation hanging like shredded flesh. "Sophie," Clara called, her voice muffled, swallowed by the space. A faint whimper answered her, small and broken, from the far end, where the box of drawings had been. She limped toward it, her hands outstretched, the pulse pounding in her ears, drowning out the whispers. The box was there, lid ajar, its contents spilled across the floor, drawings curling and yellowed, but new ones too, wet with red, still drying. She knelt, her fingers trembling as she sifted through them. Ethan sinking into the earth, his face blank, Mark slashing his own throat, black ooze spilling, her standing here, now surrounded by shadows. And then Sophie, curled in a ball, her eyes wide, a faceless figure looming over her, dated today. "Mommy!" The whimper came again, closer, and Clara spun, her heart leaping. Sophie sat against the wall, her blonde hair tangled, her nightgown torn, her small body trembling. "Sophie!" Clara cried, rushing to her, dropping to her knees. She reached out, tears blurring her vision, and pulled her daughter into her arms, her warmth real, her heartbeat faint but there. "Oh God, you're okay, you're okay." But Sophie didn't hug her back. Her arms hung limp, her head lolling against Clara's shoulder, and her voice was a whisper, "You shouldn't have come." Clara froze, pulling back, and Sophie's eyes met hers. Not black, not hollow, but dull, lifeless like a doll's. "It's too late," she said, and her mouth opened wider until it split her face, a scream erupting. Not hers, but the house's, a deafening wail that shook the attic. Clara stumbled back, Sophie's body slumping lifeless, and the floor beneath her cracked open. Not a small fissure, but a chasm, exhaling that sickly glow, the writhing mass surging up, hands clawing air. The real Sophie was gone, replaced by this thing, this husk, rising now, its split face smiling, its voice a chorus, "You're ours." The shadows flooded in, solid now, their claws sinking into her arms, dragging her toward the chasm. "No!" Clara roared, kicking, her hands scrabbling for the box. She grabbed it, hurling it into the gap, drawing, scattering, and the shadows shrieked, releasing her, diving after it. The chasm pulsed, sucking air, and she crawled away, her ankle dragging toward the hatch. But the ladder was gone, replaced by a smooth drop, the hall below twisting, the walls bleeding red, the drawings alive, slashing themselves. A hand grabbed her shoulder, not a shadow, but Mark, his hollow eyes inches from hers, his voice a rasp. "You did this!" She screamed, shoving him, and he fell, tumbling into the chasm, his roar fading as the glow swallowed him. The Sophie thing advanced, its split face dripping, and the attic tilted, the floor sloping toward the void, pulling her back. She clawed at the beams, splinters tearing her hands, and then a crash. The window shattered from outside, Ethan's face peering in, soot-streaked, desperate. "Mom!" he yelled, tossing a rope, jagged, makeshift, tied from torn sheets. She lunged, grabbing it, the floor collapsing beneath her, and he pulled, his small arms straining, dragging her toward the broken glass. The Sophie thing shrieked, lunging, its claws slashing her leg, and the shadows surged back, their hands wrapping around her waist. "Stay!" they roared, but Ethan yanked harder, screaming her name, and she broke free, tumbling onto the roof, glass cutting her skin, blood streaking the shingles. Ethan collapsed beside her, gasping, and the window sealed shut. The Sophie thing's face pressed against it, smiling, whispering, "You'll come back." The roof pulsed, the heartbeat deafening, and the ground below erupted, shadows, hundreds, rising from the earth, chanting her name. Ethan clung to her, sobbing, and Clara stared at the rope in her hands, not sheets, but Sophie's nightgown torn and bloody, tied into a lifeline. Her breath stopped, and the house laughed, a deep guttural sound, as the shadows climbed the walls, reaching for them, the night sky bleeding red above. Part 9. The Red Beneath the Sky. The night sky bled above Clara and Ethan, a crimson stain spreading across the heavens, dripping down in streaks that hissed as they struck the roof. The shadows clawed up the house's walls, their faceless forms stretching, merging, a tide of darkness that chanted her name in 1,000 stolen voices. "Clara, Clara, Clara," each syllable a hammer against her skull. She clutched Ethan, his small body trembling against hers, the rope of Sophie's torn, bloody nightgown still tangled in her hands, its weight a cruel anchor. The pulse roared through the shingles, shaking them loose, and the Sophie thing's blank face pressed against the sealed window, its split smile widening, whispering, "You'll come back," as the glass cracked under its stare. "We have to move," Clara shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony, the wind howling with a sour, rotting edge. She dragged Ethan toward the roof's edge, her broken ankle grinding bone against bone, pain searing up her leg. Blood slicked her grip, her gashed hands slipping on the tiles, but she pushed forward, Ethan stumbling beside her, his eyes wide with terror. The shadows reached the roof, their claws scraping, tearing shingles away, and the house groaned, a deep guttural bellow that shook the earth below. "Jump!" she yelled, shoving Ethan toward the drop. He hesitated, peering down at the yard, now a writhing mass of shadows, their hands clawing up, mouths gaping, and shook his head, sobbing. "We won't make it. We have to." Clara grabbed him, her arms trembling, and leapt, pulling him with her. They fell, the air rushing past, and hit the frozen grass hard, her ankle snapping fully now, a white-hot jolt that stole her breath. She rolled, shielding Ethan, and scrambled up, dragging him toward the tree line, or where it had been. The fog had swallowed everything, a thick, stinking shroud that pulsed with the house's heartbeat, and the shadows surged after them, faster, relentless. "Keep running," she gasped, limping forward, Ethan's hand in hers, his small frame shaking but moving. The ground buckled beneath them, cracks splitting the earth, exhaling that sickly glow. Hands reaching up, skeletal, dripping, clawing at their feet. She kicked one away, its fingers snapping like twigs, and pulled Ethan harder, her vision blurring with tears, blood, exhaustion. The house loomed behind, its windows black, its walls bleeding red, the drawings peeling free, floating through the fog like specters, slashing their own throats in midair. A scream, not hers, not Ethan's, pierced the chaos. Sophie's voice, real, raw, from somewhere ahead. "Mommy, help!" Clara's heart lurched, hope flaring despite the nightmare, and she veered toward it, dragging Ethan through the fog. The shadows hissed, closing in, their claws brushing her back, her neck, but she pushed on, following the cry. "Sophie, I'm coming!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The fog parted, revealing a clearing, a circle of dead grass, untouched by shadows, the pulse muted here, the air still. Sophie stood in the center, small, pale, her nightgown clean now, her blonde hair glowing faintly in the red light. "Mommy," she whimpered, reaching out, her eyes wide alive, not black, not hollow. Clara sobbed, dropping Ethan's hand, stumbling toward her, arms outstretched. "Sophie, oh God," she reached her, pulling her close, her warmth frail, her heartbeat strong. "You're here, you're safe." But Sophie's arms didn't wrap around her. She stiffened, her breath hitching, and whispered, "You shouldn't have." Clara pulled back, dread pooling in her gut, and Sophie's face changed. Not splitting, not smiling, but aging, her skin wrinkling, her eyes sinking, her hair graying in seconds. "What?" Clara choked, stepping back, and Sophie's voice deepened, layered, ancient. "You brought us here." The ground trembled, the clearing cracking open, and Sophie's form dissolved into ash, blowing away in the wind, leaving Clara staring at nothing. "No," she screamed, falling to her knees, clawing at the dirt, but Ethan grabbed her, pulling her up. "Mom, it's not her. It's the house." His voice was shrill, panicked, and she turned, seeing the shadows encircling them, the fog thickening, the pulse roaring back. The house stood closer now, impossibly close, its door ajar, its windows weeping red, the Sophie thing perched on the roof, smiling, Mark's hollow form in the doorway, beckoning. "We can't fight it," Ethan sobbed, clinging to her, and Clara's resolve cracked. The drawings had shown this over and over for decades, centuries. Her family, trapped, dying, returning. Mark's words, Sophie's, the shadows, "You brought us here." Her mind reeled, memories fracturing, not 3 days ago, but lifetimes, endless cycles of moving in, losing them, starting again. She'd chosen this house, hadn't she? A bargain, a steal, a pull she couldn't explain, drawing her back. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, but the shadows lunged, their claws sinking into her arms, dragging her toward the house. Ethan screamed, kicking, his small hands clawing at them, but they pulled harder, the door yawning wider, the pulse deafening. She fought, thrashing, her broken ankle dragging, and then a flash. Not light, but sound, a voice not Sophie's, not Mark's, but hers, clear, sharp, from inside her own skull. "Let them go." She froze, the shadows pausing, their heads tilting. "What?" she gasped, and the voice came again, louder, commanding. "Let them go, and I'll stay." It was her will, her choice, rising from some buried depth. The shadows hissed, loosening their grip. Ethan stumbled free, falling to the grass, staring at her wide. "Mom, no," he yelled, lunging for her, but she pushed him back, her hands trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Run," she said, her voice steady despite the break inside her. "Find help. Don't come back." The shadows tightened around her again, pulling her toward the door, and Ethan sobbed, scrambling up, backing away as the fog swallowed him, his cries fading. The house exhaled, the pulse slowing, satisfied, and Clara stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind her. The living room was silent, the drawings still, the shadows retreating to the walls. She stood alone, the weight of her choice crushing her, and then the floor split, not violently, but slowly, deliberately, revealing the glow, the writhing mass, hands reaching up, not for her, but past her, toward the ceiling. The attic hatch creaked open, and Sophie's voice, real, terrified, whispered, "Mommy," but it wasn't alone. Ethan's voice joined it, faint, panicked, "Mom, help." Clara's breath stopped. She'd sent him away, hadn't she? The shadows laughed, low and guttural, and the hands from below surged upward, clawing at the hatch, dragging two small figures down. Sophie and Ethan screaming, their faces pale, their eyes locked on hers as they fell into the void. Part 10. The Binding of the Lost. Sophie and Ethan's screams clawed at Clara's ears as they fell, their small hands grasping air, their faces pale, terrified, so achingly real, vanishing into the glowing chasm beneath the floor. The hands from below, skeletal and relentless, dragged them down, their nails scraping the wood, leaving trails of black ooze that hissed as it burned into the boards. Clara lunged, a raw, guttural scream tearing from her throat, her broken ankle forgotten, her hands outstretched to catch them. But the floor snapped shut, seamless, silent, swallowing their cries like a beast closing its jaws. The pulse stopped, the house exhaled, and the stillness that followed was a weight crushing her chest. "No," she roared, pounding the floor, her fists splitting skin, blood smearing the wood. "Give them back. You have me. Give them back." Her voice cracked, echoing into nothing, and the shadows along the wall stirred, their faceless forms tilting, watching. The drawings pulsed once, their red streaks drying into cracked scars, and the air thickened with that metallic rot, stinging her lungs with every ragged breath. She'd stayed. She'd traded herself, her voice, her will, ringing in her skull. Let them go, and I'll stay. It had worked, hadn't it? Ethan had run, free in the fog, safe. But now his scream, Sophie's, frenetic, then here, falling. The house had lied, twisted her sacrifice, kept them all. Or had it? Her mind fractured, memories bleeding together, not days, but years, decades, cycles of this hell, her family trapped, her choice the key that locked them in. You brought us here. A creak above snapped her head up. The attic hatch hung open, a black void exhaling cold, and a faint whimper drifted down, not Sophie's, not Ethan's, but something else small and broken. Clara staggered to her feet, her body a map of pain, gashed arms, torn leg, shattered ankle, and limped to the stairs, her hands trembling on the banister. The shadows didn't stop her, didn't move, just watched, their silence a taunt. The house wanted this, wanted her to climb, to see. The stairs stretched again, endless, each step a labor, her blood dripping behind her, staining the wood. The whispers returned, soft, insidious, weaving through her mind. Stay, stay. But she pushed them away, her focus narrowing to that whimper, a thread of sound pulling her up. She reached the hatch, the ladder gone, the drop sheer, but she didn't care. She hauled herself up, her arms burning, splinters piercing her palms, and tumbled into the attic, collapsing onto the dust-choked floor. The space was different, smaller, tighter, the beams pressing low, the air heavy with damp and decay. The box was gone, the drawings too, but the walls here bled, not red, but black, a slow drip that pooled in the corners, glistening like oil. The whimper came again, closer, and Clara crawled toward it, her breath shallow, her vision blurring. "Sophie, Ethan," she whispered, her voice a rasp. A shape emerged from the shadows, not her children, but a figure small, hunched, its back to her. It rocked slowly, its hair lank and wet, dripping onto the floor, and the whimper was a low, keening sound that raised the hairs on her neck. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, edging closer, her hands shaking. It didn't turn, didn't stop, just rocked, and the black pool spread, lapping at her knees, cold and slick. She reached out, her fingers brushing its shoulder, and it spun, fast, too fast. Its face blank, eyeless, mouthless, a smooth expanse of pale flesh. She recoiled, a scream lodging in her throat, but it didn't attack. It pointed, its arm trembling, toward the far wall, where the wood was cracked, splintered, revealing a sliver of light, not the sickly glow, but something else, faint, gray real. Clara stared, hope flickering, and crawled toward it, the figure rocking behind her, its keening rising. She clawed at the crack, peeling wood away, her nails splitting, and the light grew, a window, boarded up, but beyond it, the world, trees, fog, the dawn breaking through the red sky. Freedom. She tore harder, the boards giving, and a gust of fresh air hit her, clean, cold, cutting through the rot. "Ethan." "Sophie," she shouted, her voice raw, and a faint cry answered, not from inside, but outside, distant, alive. She turned back, the figure gone, the attic empty, but the black pool surged, rising, wrapping around her legs, pulling her down. "No," she yelled, kicking, clinging to the window frame, glass cutting her hands. The shadows flooded in, their claws sinking into her shoulders, dragging her back, and the house pulsed, hard, final, a heartbeat claiming her. She screamed, her fingers slipping, and the window slammed shut. The boards were forming, sealing her in. Darkness swallowed her, the pulse fading, the whispers silent. She sank to her knees, alone, the cold seeping into her bones, and then a sound. Not a whimper, not a scream, but laughter, Sophie's, Ethan's, Mark's, layered, echoing from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. She spun, searching, and the black pools parted, revealing them, standing in the center, whole, alive, smiling. "We're home," they said in unison, their eyes black, their hands outstretched. Clara's breath stopped. They weren't hollow, weren't husks, they were hers, but not. The house hadn't taken them, it had changed them, bound them, and now it had her too. She stepped back, shaking her head, but the floor pulsed, the shadows surged, and their smiles widened, splitting their faces, revealing teeth too many, too sharp. "You stayed," they said, advancing, and the walls closed in, the attic shrinking, the black pools rising to her waist, her chest, her throat. She screamed, clawing at nothing, and the world tilted, her vision fading, until a jolt. "What?" She gasped, sitting up, not in the attic, but the living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, boxes scattered, the house quiet. Mark stood by the door, grinning, suitcase in hand. "Ready for the fresh start?" he asked, and Sophie and Ethan bounded in, laughing, normal, alive. Clara froze, her hands trembling, blood gone, ankle hole. Dream? No, the pulse thrummed faintly. The drawings flickered on the walls, faint, fleeting, and Sophie's smile twitched too wide, just for a second. "Welcome home," she whispered, and the door slammed shut, the lock clicking, the cycle beginning again.